Hi, my name's Dan Keane from Spitfire Audio. Today I'm going to be showing you how I use Abbey Road One Orchestral Foundations to add colour to my music. This was the first library in our collaboration with Abbey Road Studios, and it's a really great place to start if you're looking to write music quickly. There are pre-orchestrated ensembles, so you don't have to fine-tune the balance between instruments, and there are 5 dynamic layers, so you can really feel the progression throughout the mod wheel. Have a listen to these French horns. I love the detail in these recordings. You don't have to move the mod wheel very far before it starts opening up the sound. The other thing is the plethora of microphone positions, because it's Abbey Road One and it's more about the acoustic space than it is the instruments. We've got fantastic mixes by Simon Rhodes through to our vintage and pop signals over to our more traditional microphones. I particularly like the spill signal because this is a summation of all of the other microphones that were live when each section was recorded, and this adds a little bit more realism to your scores. And it's the combination of the microphone signals with the slightly more detailed recordings that gives this a slight edge over Albion One and other ensemble-based libraries. Now, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth and show you how I would use this library in context. So I wrote a piece of music exploring the use of colour in music. I'm going to play it to you first, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth. So there we go, a fairly sweet little piece. It's written in 4 main sections. Of course, we've got this intro, which I wanted to feel quite ethereal and quite sort of mysterious. And then it goes into this section here, which is maybe a little bit kind of mournful. And then as things start to build, we go through a slightly more optimistic sound world. And then we lead up to the big climax of the piece, which is here. So I've written it in this way because I wanted to explore these different colours. I think sometimes colour can be a bit of an abstract word. What does that really mean? Well, for me, it means 4 things. We've got kind of tone and timbre, and then depth and texture. And in this video, I want to break that down into 2 main sections, where dynamic range is what controls the tone and the timbre of our music, and then the microphone positions give us the depth and the texture. So beginning first of all with our dynamic range. When we're down in these lower dynamics, there's something beautifully soft about it. It sounds almost vulnerable, a little bit fragile, and these quiet dynamics are absolutely stunning. And of course, because we've got so many dynamic layers, we can create this beautiful ebb and flow with gentle crescendos and diminuendos. So I'm going to start off with the strings, and I'm going to start at the beginning actually. Just want you to have a listen to these chords. I've set my releases to be really, really high. So when we do these repeated notes, they just sort of gradually take over from each other. So I'm using the long tremolo here on both the high and the low strings. As we move into this slightly more mournful section, I wanted to experiment with the concertinos, which is where the instrumentalists play with mutes on. So have a listen to this section here. So what this does is it slightly removes some of those more harsh frequencies between 1 and 3 kilohertz and instead creates a slightly heightened top edge. I find this goes really, really well with long horns. To accompany this slightly more mournful sound, I decided to add some low strings pizzicatos. And again, the dynamics are controlled by velocity here, so you just have to hit them really quietly. We've created a really lush texture here, so I decided to add some high winds that are maybe a little bit opposing to that. In all of these performances, I'm using 3 controls. The first is the mod wheel, which controls the dynamics. The second is vibrato, which doesn't apply to the woodwinds, but does apply to the strings. And then the last is CC11, which is expression, which is the general volume of this instrument. So this helps you to blend between sections if you need to. And of course, being an ensemble-based library, you do end up with a smaller track count. As you can see, I've only got 40 tracks here. As we move into this slightly more rejoiceful section, I decided to add a little theme here. And then as we get into the climax of the piece, I'm riding the mod wheel to give it a little bit more impact. This opening theme here, I decided to copy over into the glockenspiel at the end. I think brass instruments are a particularly good tell at defining whether or not a library has big dynamic range. Have a listen to this section, just the brass on its own. You can see that I didn't even go all the way up to the top of the mod wheel because it just took over the entire orchestra. Now I find if I want the timbre to really open out and for the tone to be really full, I'll add another octave on the top. So where possible, I've snuck in a little extra layer here. Playing lines in octaves like this is a really good way to mask the fact that this doesn't have any legatos. The more layers that are moving together, the more blurred the sound becomes, and so this works really, really well. Moving down into the cymbals here, I'm quite sparing with my cymbal swells, but as you can hear, this is quite gentle at the beginning. Has this fantastic tail. And then going into the build-up section here, you can see that I'm a little bit stronger with this. Now, if you've got this library, it's worth noting that if you hold on to a cymbal crescendo, it will decay naturally for the full duration, whereas if you let go of it, it will release quite quickly. So on the side of realism, I always leave it a little bit longer, and I find that this helps to create a nice bloom in the middle of my arrangements. So having shown you the full dynamic range of the library, I want to move on to the other side, which is the microphone positions. This is something that I'm particularly excited about because this library came out before I joined the Spitfire team, and so I hadn't really given this a proper test drive until preparing for this video. And it's been amazing to look through the library and see all of these different microphone positions. It makes such a big difference. If I just open up just a blank instrument on its own, so this is the horns again, and if I just disable all of these microphones and then load up the close on their own, for example. If I then compare that with the ambient microphones, now, I mentioned that depth and texture can be created with the microphone positions. What does this mean? Well, basically, as you can see here, I've created a whole load of normal tracks and then some that I've called out, some that I've called focus. And this is basically my attempt to get a little bit more detail in the sound by zooming in a little bit on the sections or maybe coming out a little bit. So I've got my main longs here, and for the most part, the sections are mixed in relatively similar ways. I've got the ambient mics at 100%, then I've got quite a lot of the spill mics, and then a little bit of the tree. Tree 1 is your more kind of traditional sound. Tree 2 is a little bit tighter, a little bit more focused. So if I then switch over to, say, the out, what does that mean? Well, it's basically the same mix, but I've got my outriggers as well. The outriggers are level with the tree microphone, so level with the conductor's podium, but they're positioned at the far sides. So you can see that in the majority of any of the outrigger microphones, I'm actually doing this in the bigger section of the piece. So this creates a slightly wider stereo image as things get really exciting. Now you can see here that in the more focused tracks here, that I'm actually using a combination of mix 1 in this case and tree 2, and again lots of the spill mics. The spill, as I mentioned, is a summation of all of the other microphones that were live while each section were recording, and it's really interesting to hear the spill mics from, say, the timpani or the glockenspiel, and to hear what it would have sounded like in the rest of the room combined. Just makes it sound a little bit more realistic. So as we go through, I'll show you the focus tracks first of all. And of course, naturally with these tremolos, the ambience, it loses some of the transient of the bows scraping over the strings. So have a listen to this. Now, if I play this section here, which had the theme that I added earlier, if I just pull this tree out, you'll hear the effect this has. It's a little bit louder, yes, but it's also got just a little bit more focus on the instruments. I'm just going to mute this theme for a moment. As you can see here, we've got our main longs and then our high strings long with the outriggers. Again, opening out a little bit, I'm not using the mutes here, so it just feels a little bit broader. But have a listen here and see if you can hear the way the stereo image widens slightly. Now, of course, this is a lot easier to do with samples than it is with real recordings, but it's not to say that you couldn't mute the outrigger microphones until later in the piece and then bring them out a little bit. I think it's always fun to experiment with the way that different microphones blend together. You can see here that in this softer section, I was using the outrigger microphones more than the tree, and the reason for this is because I wanted to give it a little bit more perspective. It sounds round and warm and slightly distant, whereas the trumpets here sound a little bit more focused. This is another thing for creating a little bit more texture in your scores. I find that the closer microphones give a little bit more bite, whereas the ambient microphones tend to blur the sound a little bit more. It's always fun to contrast between the different sections as well. You can see here down in the low woods, I've actually used some vintage microphones. Here I selected the vintage 2 signal. This is a pair of classic ribbon microphones placed by the conductor. So it's sort of like the tree, but it just has a slightly flatter profile to it. With the percussion, I was quite careful as well not to get too close to the instrument. So you can see that in the timpani, I've used a little bit of mix 1 and then also a lot of the ambience, the tree 2 and then the spill mics. I guess the tree is naturally quite far away from the timpani anyway, so we get a slightly more distant perspective there. This metal ensemble here is just some small cymbal hits. And again, I'm using mostly ambient with a little bit of tree 1 and the spills again. Now, I was really pleased with the bass drum microphones. I'd started with just the ambient and the spill, but it wasn't giving me the transient that I was looking for. So I actually pulled up some of the close mic to 50% just to give it a little bit more punch. This goes particularly well with the soft booms as well. So combined together. So there you go. I hope you found this video to be useful, and if you did, please click like and subscribe if you haven't done already. We've got so many exciting things coming soon. I'm going to play this piece to you once more, but thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again very, very soon. Goodbye.